Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. May God's peace and light and blessings and mercy and grace be with you. This is Ihsan, and I wanted to share with you guys a little bit of an insight or a message about something that's extremely important in our lives, and something in an area of life in which we have suffered, in which we suffer tremendously as human beings in the modern world, in the current day and age we live in. And that is in the area of human relationships. Traditional societies, traditional cultures evolve over hundreds and thousands of years to preserve sacred bonds of kinship between human beings, to preserve relationships, to strengthen relationships, because that is where our strength comes from. As human beings, we will die on our own, independently and alone. When we're isolated and alone, we die. There's a saying amongst the wise people that oneness suits only God. It's actually a classical saying in the language of Farsi that oneness or being alone only suits the Creator, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our Lord, is one. But human beings were not created to be alone, isolated, separated from one another. We were created to be in communities, in tribes, in families, to have these strong bonds and ties of kinship that support and sustain us at every aspect of our lives, in every phase of our lives, in every stage of our lives, in our daily life. This is something that has been lost as a result of the industrial and technological revolutions. The modern world, which is based on technology, technological innovation, productivity, has essentially isolated human beings. And this is one of the paradoxes of technology. One of the ironies of technology is that it continues to separate human beings. Every new technological innovation, in some way or other, tends to separate human beings. And we are victims of, I don't want to use that word victims, but we are really living in a situation in which we are being increasingly isolated and separated from one another. We are working more and more independently and alone. Our relationships, even within families and homes, becomes increasingly segmented and separated, and a lot of times, again, because of technology. And this leads to tremendous levels of unhappiness. Another factor is the cultural dynamic towards self-interest. We live again in a society and in a culture which conditions us to continually pursue self-interest at the expense of our relationships, at the expense of often family. This is the cultural norm now, to go away for college and for career and to move for professional development. And what we don't realize is that we're losing something tremendously important in the process. Family, relationships, ties of kinship. The Holy Prophet ﷺ continually emphasized the importance of maintaining ties of kinship. And this is echoed throughout the Quran. They who keep the ties of kinship, who maintain the ties of kinship, family bonds, relationships, tribal bonds. And tribe is extremely important, not in the sense of us and them, but in the sense of having a place within the world, having an existence connected to other human beings in which you can find yourself within that hierarchy and within that diaspora of relationships. You know, for the first time, when I actually went back to visit Afghanistan in the early 2000s, it was a surreal experience, and it was profound on so many levels. And I remember meeting people on the street who knew my family, who knew my parents, who knew my father, who knew my relatives. And as soon as they recognized who I was, based on my family relationships, they knew who I was. They knew where I came from. They knew my family. And it's an incredible experience to be in a place where you have a sense of belonging, where your family is known, your people are known, your parents and your ancestors are known, and you are a result of that. The world we live in has essentially separated and severed this. We almost feel like we've just sort of dropped off on the earth alone and isolated. And you'll see that the culture continually adds to this severing and separation of ties of kinship. Through media, through culture, through every aspect of influence in our lives, family is continually ignored or separated or pushed away and it's continually focused on the self. You see this in media, for example, in television, in movies. If you look at a film that's made in Turkey or in Iran, you cannot eliminate, or anywhere in a Muslim society or culture, or traditional culture and society for that matter, you cannot find a story of a human being separate from the story of their family, from their relatives, and from their tribe. It's connected, right? One of my favorite shows now, for example, is Resurrection Ertuğrul. And if you haven't seen this, I've been wanting to make a video on this for quite some time now. Highly recommend checking it out. It's on Netflix. If you have a Netflix subscription, I think they're up to season 4 at the moment. One of the best shows you can watch. And I don't usually watch a lot of TV. In fact, very rarely. I have trouble watching it because there's so little that's worth watching and that's good and beneficial. But this show, for example, it's a Turkish show. And you see the lives of these people living, in the early ages prior to the founding of the Ottoman Empire. You see the way they live, you see the way they live, and how strong the bonds of family and tribe, of honor, of integrity are in the lives of human beings. Nobody's alone, and they don't live just for themselves. They live for their people. This is the difference between a culture of we versus a culture of me. And the culture of me leads to misery and unhappiness and suffering because human beings were not meant to live alone and isolated. And that's what self-interest and selfishness and self-centeredness ultimately leads us to nothing but ourselves, to being left with nobody but ourselves. If you look at, subhanAllah, this is beginning to sound like a little bit of a rant, but it's something that's been in my heart for a long time. It's something that I need to communicate, and I'm praying that people will listen and tune in and wake up and change our way of life. At least change your way of life, or at least begin to move in that direction. Right? I've seen so many family and friends and relatives isolated and alone supposedly at the golden years of their lives. Children have gone off to school. They're living in different cities, often in different states, and they're left alone, isolated and alone, completely alone in a big house with nothing to do but stare at the walls. And they're miserable and suffering. A few years ago, this really hit me when I was at a Costco, and I saw this elderly couple sitting outside to have lunch, and I sat down at the table with them, and I just began to speak with them. They were a beautiful elderly couple, really probably at least in their 80s, but they just had some sort of peace to them and beauty to them. It was an American couple, an elderly couple, and I began speaking with them, and they seemed quite lonely. They were there together, husband and wife, which was beautiful to see in this day and age, especially at that age, but they were alone, and I could see the loneliness in them. And so I began to inquire, about their children, about their families. And they said, yes, they have, I think, maybe 3 children, and each one is living in a different part of the country. One was on the East Coast, one was in northern Pacific Northwest, another one was in another city in California. And these people were essentially living on their own, and they would see their kids, or their kids might see them maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. And, maybe they would call every now and then to check in or say hello or whatever. But for the most part, this elderly couple who sacrificed their lives to raise their children, to bring them into the world, and this is any parent, once they have children, good or bad, the best, not the best, to a large degree often, if they're doing their job, they're sacrificing a significant portion of their lives to raise children, to provide for them, to care for them. And once a human being has a child, your life and your personal interest and all of that really gets pushed aside. It's gone. Right? Now you're living for another life form that's dependent on you. So this elderly couple raised their children and put them through college and set them up to succeed and live in the world. And then the children leave and they're gone. And the poor parents who have spent 20 years raising those children, not pursuing their own personal lives and interests, are left alone, and that's miserable. This is a crime. This is a crime in our culture and in our society. To do this to our parents and to our ancestors, this is completely against Islam and the way of our Prophet ﷺ and the way of all prophets. Human life was meant to be strong through ties of kinship, and these are meant to be preserved, and not just in name, and not just on a holiday or occasion where somebody calls their parents and sees how they're doing or visits them or meets once a year for a Christmas holiday, or, for Thanksgiving, or for Eid, or whatever. Human life is meant to be lived together. That's the value, that's the barakah, that's the ni'mah from Allah Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. And traditional cultures and societies preserve this, although this is being lost to a large degree throughout the world now. And we have to wisen up, because what leads to human happiness is not money, it's not success, it's not technology, it is not entertainment, it is not the latest and newest toy, it is human relationships. It's having people around you, not being alone, having your basic needs met, having food and shelter, and then really the rest of it is in the relationships. That's the key to human happiness. Having your basic human needs met, your most basic needs. And then happiness comes from relationships with others. There's an amazing story about a young boy. It's a true story, and they wrote a book about it called Into the Wild. I think his name was Chris McCandless, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm, I'll correct it in the description below this video. And he, again, as a product of this society, extremely young man, extremely wealthy, came from a good family, went to pursue happiness, right? His own happiness. And he thought for him, going out into nature and being at one with creation was the key to happiness, because he could see how sort of dysfunctional and corrupt society had become. So he left everything. He left his money, he left his trust fund, he left everything, abandoned it, and went off into the wilderness. And he, for a time, discovered what happiness was in nature, right? Another thing that we've lost in the world today, our connection to the natural world. We're living in a completely artificial reality. So he reconnected with his essential nature, his fitrah, and began to find great happiness. But over time, he began to realize that something was profound, was missing from his life. And that was other human beings. It was people. It was love of one another. Love that can only be shared between human beings. And it's a bit of a tragic story, but it's by divine wisdom that this story even reaches us. Because had what happened not happened, we probably would never have heard of this story. What happened with this guy is he was out in the wilderness, and he mistakenly identified some berries as edible, but they turned out to be poisonous. So he ate these, and he became very ill. He became extremely ill, and there was no medicine around. There was no way to get to help. He was out in the wilderness by himself. They've even, in fact, made a movie about this, and you should definitely check it out. It's called Into the Wild. He ends up becoming sick, and within a short amount of time, dying from this debilitating, toxic this toxic plant, these berries that he's eaten. And so he's on his last breaths of life, and he knows, and he's kept a journal, so we have a record of a lot of his experiences. What he ends up doing, the last thing he etches into his memoirs, into his journal, and into the place where he was staying, is this statement: happiness only real when shared. Happiness only real when shared. He had just enough strength in the last moments of his life to write this, for anyone to find it. And this was the message of his life. Happiness is only real when it is shared. Whether you're enjoying a good meal, entertainment, anything you do in life, any experience is only real when it's shared. And this is why even the idea of being in paradise but alone is insufficient for a believer. And that's why the Prophet of Allah ﷺ will not enter into paradise until everyone has been pardoned and forgiven by Allah Almighty. He will continue praying and asking for forgiveness from God, for creation, for human beings, until Allah forgives them and forgives them and forgives them. This is known as the Shafa' of Rasulullah ﷺ, which was his most important dua that he would make to Allah, to grant him that shafa, to grant him that intercession for creation, so he could pray for their forgiveness on their behalf in the Day of Judgment, so that none would be left out from Allah's mercy. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him that. And there are many ahadith about this. The Prophet ﷺ will not enter into paradise until everyone has been admitted and entered with Allah's mercy and forgiveness. So we as human beings have to remember what it is that makes us human, what it is that gives us life, and what it is that gives us health and strength. It's community, it's family, it's relationships, Stop being isolated and alone. And there is no benefit to sacrifice family relationships for the sake of personal advancement, because you will lose in the end. And Shaitan knows this. Iblis knows this. So he's created a world, he's engineered a world over hundreds and thousands of years at this point. And what we're living in really is, to a large degree, the mastermind project of someone, of a creature, of a being, of an entity and his minions that want nothing other than human suffering, that want nothing other than human misery and human failure. They've created a society and a culture and a world that separates human beings, right? That increases egoism and narcissism and selfishness and self-centeredness, because that is the key to destroying relationships between human beings. The culture of me versus the culture of we. Historically, in most traditional cultures, people did what was best for the family and for the tribe. Now we do what is best for us, for me. And that actually leads to your failure, to our failure as individuals, because alone and isolated, we are weak. The great goal of Islam is unity, unity of human beings. This was the purpose of Islam, to bring human beings together into an unbreakable bond that would withstand the deception, the treachery, the evil of Shaitan and those who seek to destroy human beings. When we are separated and isolated and alone, we're weak. But when we are together, we are strong. The entire system and model that we live in is based on separation of human beings, on separation and isolation. It's the old principle of divide and conquer. If human beings come together, pool their resources, pool their energy, pool their focus and work, they will be strong, can build amazing things, can live simple lives. But isolated and alone, we are weak. There's so many aspects to this topic. And I just wanted to actually just begin and open this subject. And I'll begin, inshallah ta'ala, in many ways speaking more about, and also, God willing, inshallah, providing solutions to. Because we have to come back together as human beings, in tribes, in families, in bonds of kinship that are based on light, that are based on truth, that are based on reality and based on spirituality, because those are the bonds that will sustain us. Those are the most, ultimately, the most powerful bonds. A new culture and a new reality based on unity and brotherhood and sisterhood, companionship. That is what Islam sought to guide us to. That is what we must return to. Do your best in your life to preserve the ties of kinship between you and others, especially within your household and families, relatives, because this world severs these, and we're at a great loss. We're losing that which matters most. At the end, nothing will matter. It won't matter what career you had, what car you owned, what home you had. None of that will matter. What will matter are the good times, the laughter, the friendship, the community, the goodness that you spent with other human beings, especially with your family. That comes first. And sadly, modern society is bent on destroying the family. May Allah protect us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you and guide us to wisdom. This was a bit of a rant. My love and my prayers with all of you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really strengthen us as a community and keep us united and keep us growing in real knowledge and wisdom and in intelligence towards that which matters most and that which leads to human happiness and to human health. This is really all Allah Almighty wants for us. This was the purpose of revelation. This is the purpose of Islam, human health and happiness. Nothing else. Allah Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala is utterly independent and not in need of anything we can do. Everything is for us. Everything is for us. May we have the wisdom to see it and to act upon it. May Allah bless you to your divine and true and eternal success. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.